But Brian's obviously looked at the aggregate level, the national level. But what I want to do this morning is to try to break that down a little bit more. You'll see there's a pattern in the programme that I'm kind of looking at a kind of sub-national level. Actually 2 levels of analysis here, looking at local authorities and then local authorities within police force areas. And then the next presentation, Ellie is going to look at much more local neighbourhoods. So the idea is to try and get some sense of how crime has changed as we look at different levels of geography, and how does that help us to understand what the mechanisms might be behind that, as Brian has already said. This is very much work in progress. So it's a bit less developed than some of the other papers, which is why you don't have a briefing paper, although I'd be happy to let anyone have the slides and some of my notes. And I want to thank Ellie Bates very much for doing the maps for me. Essentially what I'm going to look at is trends in recorded crimes and offences by local authority from 1996-97, which is the point at which we had our last local government reorganisation. So if we go back further than that, we don't have comparable local authorities. So that's the earliest point at which I can look, through to the year for which we have the most recent recorded crime data. That's 2012-13, which is the year prior to the reunification of the police forces. I'm looking at differences in the trends between local authorities, but also within legacy police force areas. I think that's quite important, because prior to unification, we had 8 different police forces, all controlled differently, all being managed in slightly different ways. And so it's important for us to look within those police force areas to see whether there was consistency in trends, both in terms of the recording of crimes and offences over time. I'm going to say a little bit about a change, a distinct change that we've seen in the ratio of the number of crimes to offences that are recorded over time. And I'm going to finish by looking at crime rates per 1,000 people, which gives us a slightly different perspective on how crimes change across the local authorities and within the police force areas. So starting looking at numbers of crime change and percentage of crime change over time. Brian presented this in a slightly different way, but this is the time period that I'm looking at, as you can see along the bottom, and the trends in recorded crimes, which are in green, show a fairly stable pattern actually from about the mid-90s through to the mid-2000s roughly, and then more recently in the last 7 or 8 years we've seen a fairly distinct period of decline in terms of recorded crime. Recorded offences showed a different pattern. So we saw an increase, a kind of slight incline in recorded offences in the mid to late part of the 1990s, and then a big jump. And that big jump is largely attributed to the introduction of the Scottish Crime Recording Standards, which came in at the beginning of 2004, although actually I think the police were starting to implement that the year before the introduction of the Crime Recording Standards. And essentially that was a more victim-orientated way of recording crime, which meant that lower level offences were more likely to be recorded than they had been in the past. And that was due to concerns that some crimes were being reported to the police but weren't being recorded by them. So if we look at the overall change, this is in recorded crime, and I'm only looking at recorded crime and recorded offences as kind of aggregate groups in this presentation. I have done more analysis for specific crime types, but it's a bit more complicated to present in 20 minutes. And I think actually looking at the overall big picture tells us something quite interesting about how crime and offences have changed over time, and about what police activity might have, police activity might have impacted on that. So if we look at the percentage change in the recorded crimes, just taking the point 1996-7 through to 2012-13, so this is relative change over time, you can see that actually the relative change has all been in the negative direction. So 30 out of the 32 local authorities have seen some fall in crime from that initial point to that later point. The two at the top there, the Orkney Islands and Clackmannanshire, so a slight increase. But if you look to the right, the chart on the right, that's showing the change in actual numbers of recorded crimes. And you can see if you look at Orkney and the Clackmannanshire at the top there, the actual number of crimes that were increased was minute. So they went from being very low crime areas to being slightly higher, but still very low crime areas. In the other areas, you can see that it varies a little bit in terms of the rate of change in the different local authorities, but actually 26 out of the 32 local authorities saw a crime drop that was more than 20% of what it had been in 96, 97. And the big winners there at the bottom, East Renfrewshire, with an over 60% fall in crime in total over that period. So in terms of recorded crimes, the pattern across Scotland generally seems to be a fall. If we look at the absolute numbers, we can see that actually there are 4 areas where the numbers have declined the most, and they're the 4 big urban areas. So City of Glasgow in particular, but also City of Edinburgh, Aberdeen and Dundee. There are other areas which have seen a fairly moderate size drop, but many others that have seen actually quite a small change over time as well. If we look at police force areas, then we can see all 8 police force areas saw a fall in crime over that time period, some more than others. Central and Northern didn't see quite so much of a percentage change, and in terms of absolute numbers, you can see that the numbers didn't change very much either, so a pattern of kind of stability almost in those areas, just looking at these 2 time points. Other areas, for example, Tayside, police force area, a big winner, 55% fall in crimes over those 2 time points, although again, when you look at raw numbers, I mean, it's not an insignificant number, about just over 20,000 fewer crimes being recorded in the Tayside Police Force area in 2012-13 compared to 17 years prior. But again, the big winner in terms of the crime drop was Strathclyde, where we saw a very high absolute change in crime. Ellie very kindly mapped this out for me, and I could spend 20 minutes just explaining the maps, so I'm not going to say very much about it other than that in specific areas, I don't know whether I can use there's a little blipper, no, there's not. In some areas we can see they're quite consistent over time, so the red areas are areas where crime didn't drop so much. The blue areas are the areas where the crime dropped more, and the kind of grey and white areas are kind of somewhere in the middle. And you can see around about the kind of central area, Stirling, Falkirk, Clackmannanshire, there, that they're kind of stubbornly red on both maps. You can see that some of the islands are stubbornly red on both maps. But actually, when you look at raw numbers, the consistency in terms of the mapping isn't brilliant. So it doesn't always help just to look at raw numbers in terms of trying to map out change. If we move to look at recorded offences, what we can see is much more variability. So where before we were seeing a big fall in all the local authorities, when we look at offences, we can see, well, some areas have gone up, some by quite a large margin, particularly Stirling, gone up by 117% in terms of the number of recorded offences between those 2 time points. And other areas at the bottom shown quite large falls in the number of offences. Murray, for example, showed a fall of about 53% in the number of recorded offences. So a much bigger picture of variability in terms of what's been happening in recorded offences. And some areas in the middle you can see there actually haven't changed very much. And if we look at the absolute numbers on the right-hand side, you can see actually, other than Glasgow City, which saw a very large increase, something like about 50,000 more offences being recorded in Glasgow City in 2012-13 compared to 1996-7. Most other local authorities haven't actually shown that much of an absolute change. Fife is the area that has shown the largest reduction in the number of offences, and also quite a large reduction in crimes as well. Again, looking at the police force areas, we can see that Central area has increased the most in terms of recorded offences. Relatively speaking, it's gone up by over 60%, whereas Fife's gone down by more than 40%. So a huge amount of variability, both in local authorities and across the police force areas, in terms of what's been happening in recorded offences. Although again, looking at the absolute numbers, most of the police force areas didn't show that much change between those 2 time points. Strathclyde and Fife really are the 2 that showed the most change. And again, if we look at it by map, we can see that there are some stubbornly persistent areas. Again, kind of Central comes out here as being red on both maps, and parts of Strathclyde also come out as being red on both maps, which suggests that those are the areas where there's been the biggest increase. Other areas suggest that there's been much more decrease, so that would include Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire up there, and parts of the borders as well. But again, the consistency across the maps, when you're looking just at raw numbers, isn't that helpful, and I'll come back to the maps a bit later. So I want to look now and change in recorded crimes and offences using index trends, which essentially fixes the crime rates at the earliest time point we have, which is 96, 97, and then looks at how those changed over time. And using index trends is quite useful because it allows us to compare the local authorities with themselves over time, but it also allows us to see whether those local authorities within police force areas are comparable to other neighbouring local authorities within the same police force areas. And in theory, within the old structure of policing, we should have seen reasonably consistent trends within police force areas, but not necessarily across police force areas because we had 8 chief constables doing different things. And if we look at Legacy Grampian, which consists of 3 local authorities there, Aberdeen City, Aberdeenshire and Moray, you can see if we look at the recorded crime trends indexed at 96, 97, actually, I mean, there's a bit of fluctuation there, but they're more or less consistent pattern over time in terms of a general reduction in crime. There's clearly been little things happening in the mid-2000s, which I'll come back to a little bit later, but generally speaking, a fairly consistent pattern. I don't think the Chief Constable would be too worried about crime trends varying that much within their police force area. But if we look at recorded offences, we see very different patterns. So something in particular was happening in Aberdeen City during the early part of the 2000s that wasn't happening in Aberdeenshire and Moray. Was that caused by some massive increase in offending within Aberdeen City? I suspect not. I think it's probably more likely to be due to policing practice or policies that impacted on the activities of the police within Aberdeen City during that period. There's also kind of little mini peaks that came a little bit later for the other 2 areas, but generally speaking, in the area where there was least intervention in terms of police force activity, their offence rates have gone down the most. Those areas where there was a bit more in terms of activity, and we can detect that because they're kind of spikes and peaks rather than a kind of consistent pattern, then their offence rates didn't go down quite so much. If we look at Legacy Central, we've got what I like to call the shark fin effect of Clackmannanshire, where we've got Falkirk and Stirling showing fairly consistent trends over time again, but Clackmannanshire having quite a large peak there. And I did actually look to see what that was, and I think, if I remember correctly, it was fire raising and vandalism. So looking like that the police had a particular strategy of tackling fire raising and vandalism within Clackmannanshire during that kind of 2006 to 2008 period. But again, the kind of crime trend fell back to almost the same level that it had been in 96, 97, suggesting, and which is at a similar level to the other 2 areas, suggesting that it may have had a short-term effect, but it didn't necessarily have a long-term effect in terms of driving down crime rates because they're still fairly consistent by 2012-13. If we look at recorded offences, well, it's a bit of a jumble, but we start to see a less consistent picture in terms of the recording of offences within Legacy Central, with some areas kind of finishing, Stirling for example, finishing more than 200% higher than it had been in 1996-7, whereas Clackmannanshire shows more of a kind of stable picture. I'll run through them very quickly, but it was really just to illustrate that when you look at each of the police force areas, we tend to see a similar picture, that levels of crime rates tend to be more consistent, although again we've got the kind of shark fin of Midlothian, which is also driven by fire raising and vandalism, and also targeting crimes of dishonesty in that period as well. So we've got a kind of more or less consistent pattern in terms of recorded trends in crime, with the exception of the odd bit of specific targeting, whereas much less consistency in terms of the recording of offences. And we see this kind of spike in the mid-2000s. Now, for those of you that remember back that far, the mid-2000s were a particular period where we had a lot of attention on low-level antisocial behaviour. The Labour Lib Dem coalition at the time was very exercised about all these unruly feral youths running about creating mayhem in the countryside of Scotland, and they introduced a number of policies which are attempted to try and diminish that, and practice changed, but not in all local authorities. So we can see here that in the city of Edinburgh and the Scottish borders, there does appear to have been some quite large increase in targeting of specific offence types, but it's not consistent across all of the local authorities within the Lothian and Borders Police Force area. I've lumped Tayside and Fife together because Fife is a single local authority police force area, but it's quite interesting because they're neighbours. It makes sense to put them together, and we can see actually on the left there that recorded crime In the Tayside area, it was pretty consistent over time within the 3 areas that make up Tayside, whereas Fife showed a slightly different picture, an increase in recorded crime up to about 2004-2005, and then a period of decline afterwards. So even neighbouring police force areas were seeing quite different trends in terms of underlying changes in crime, or at least recording of crime. Whereas if we look at the offences, again, there's quite a large degree of consistency within Tayside, which shows a big focus on offences, mostly motor vehicle offences, actually, if you look at it in detail, whereas very little change in offences within Fife. So these 2 neighbouring police force areas were dealing with crimes and offences in quite different ways with different focus. Legacy Northern, well, the numbers when you get to Northern, the Highlands and Islands tend to be quite small, and that tends to make trends fluctuate quite a bit. Again, it's a bit of a messy picture for both crimes and offences, although there's probably a bit more consistency when it came to recording crimes than when it came to recording offences. A couple of quite big spikes in the Orkney Islands. I haven't looked at that to see what that might be explained by, but again, you know, differences in terms of the recording of crimes and offences with, for example, the Western Isles here showing a very large reduction, 50% reduction over time in the recording of offences, whereas the other parts of Northern were showing a kind of increase and may have been targeting offences a bit more. I've lumped Dumfries and Galloway together with Strathclyde, and I've included this in just to show you the impact that 1 or 2 areas can have on the trends. So I've kept the y-axis stable for both of these 2 trends, and you can see that while crime has been kind of coming down, the picture in terms of offences is much more messy, and then you've got these 2 big spikes in the middle there. That's East Ayrshire and North Lanarkshire, which, if I recall correctly, when I looked at them, are both explained by specific targeted interventions on motor vehicle offences. But those spikes in 1 or 2 areas can drive particular overarching trends, which is why it's important to break it down and not just look at the aggregate picture. But if we take the outliers out, actually what we see is that within the red line on the top of the left is Dumfries and Galloway. So even though it neighbours Strathclyde, they were focusing on crime, or crime rates were increasing over that period, which is explained by other crimes. And I haven't investigated fully what those other crimes were, but there would seem to be some period of targeting of specific crime types in Dumfries and Galloway that wasn't mirrored in parts of Strathclyde. And then actually, although kind of Strathclyde in some ways breaks down into 3 groups, there's East Renfrewshire at the bottom that just shows a kind of fairly steady decline in recorded crime. There's a group in the middle which kind of declined a bit in the late 1990s, stabilised and then fell again, and then another group a little bit further up that stabilised for much longer, till about 2009-10 before declining, but essentially more or less consistent patterns in recording of crimes in Strathclyde. It's spaghetti junction when it comes to looking at offences. Very difficult to find any consistent pattern or any time point at which there was targeting of specific offence types. There's peaks and troughs and stable things going up and things coming down, so it's very, very difficult to see an overarching picture, although all of those lines on the right end above 100, so they were all higher than they were in 1996-97. All of the lines on the left for crimes end below 100, so crimes had gone down consistently across all the local authorities. If we look at the ratio in terms of the number of crimes to the number of offences that are recorded over time, we can see that actually there's been an increase. So in other words, in 1996-97, for every crime that was recorded, there was about 1.3 offences recorded on average. By the time we get to 2012-13, for every crime that's recorded, there was on average 2.1 offences recorded. So the balance between crimes and offences has shifted. That means that the police activity has shifted. The time that police are spending on particular types of offending and offences and crimes within local authorities has changed over time. But it hasn't changed everywhere. So if you look at the chart on the left, what you can see is that in 4 police force areas, there's been this increase in terms of the amount of offences being recorded compared to crimes, particularly in Dumfries and Galloway, which was already high to begin with, so it clearly dealt with a lot more offences think crimes, it was 2.5 in 96-97, but that's increased to almost 4 by the time we get to 2012-13. And in Central, Strathclyde and Tayside, there's also been quite a distinctive increase in this ratio. So in other words, the police in those areas are dealing with more low-level stuff than they were before, whereas in the other 4 police force areas over that time period, the trends were pretty stable. So even though crimes and offences may have been changing, the ratio of crimes to offences didn't change that much over time. And it can be kind of illustrated in this. It's not a brilliant chart, I agree, but these 3 lines represent 1996, that's the blue line, 2004, that's the green line, and 2012, that's the kind of beigey coloured line. And what you can see is that over time, the line has kind of shifted towards the left, which means that the number of crimes recorded is getting fewer, the number of offences recorded is getting higher. And Glasgow, which of course is an outlier, as you would expect, you can see how it moves up and to the left, which means that the number of offences being recorded is greater per number of crimes. Most of the other local authorities are kind of bunched together, but these regression lines kind of show the overarching trend. Finally, I'm just going to look at rates per 1,000 people, and this is important because it allows us to take account of population size and population change, because we know that actually the population has changed in Scotland over time, so it's important to take account of whether actually crimes are increasing or reducing in specific areas because we've seen a change in the population. And I've just kind of lumped them together a little bit. What we can see looking at Strathclyde, Dumfries and Galloway at the top there, Legacy Grampian on the left, and Legacy, Tayside and Fife on the right here, is that there has been some change in terms of recorded crimes over time when we take it as a rate per 1,000 people, and generally speaking it's a declining pattern, as we saw with the raw numbers. But what stands out actually is that the rates per 1,000 people for the big urban areas are much higher. So if you look at the early parts of the charts, the 1990s, you can see that City of Glasgow at the top there, much higher than other neighbouring local authorities. Aberdeen City is much higher, and Dundee City is much higher over here as well, but the gap has narrowed. So what we've seen is a decline in crime in the big urban areas. Actually, the trends in many of the other local authorities, although it's generally on the decline, the level of change has been much lower. So what we've seen is a big reduction in crimes in our big urban areas, less so in our smaller, more semi-rural or rural communities. But by the time we got to 2012-13, the gap has narrowed between the big urban areas and the other areas, but it hasn't closed. So we're still seeing a higher rate of crime in those big urban areas. These 3 local authorities or 3 police force areas actually show much more consistency. Again, you can see that City of Edinburgh is higher than its other neighbouring local authorities in terms of rates, and it's come down a bit. The gap has narrowed. It's not quite as extreme as the others. Highland, which of course is not a kind of big urban area, but it's more urban than the islands, you can see again that that's kind of higher. So again, it's kind of suggesting that we're having a different picture in terms of rates within our big urban areas compared to smaller ones. And actually when we map that out, we can see that when we use rates, we get much more consistent maps that show us that kind of change in terms of looking at change in numbers or looking at change in percentage of crimes by rates give us kind of very stable pictures. So again, we can see Central here coming out red on both maps, and we can see the Highlands and Islands coming out quite consistency there in terms of the areas which are at the higher end of the scale in terms of crimes, and then other areas, particularly round about kind of Tayside and Grampian, coming out much better. And if we look at offences, well, we don't find the same picture. We don't find that offences have declined in terms of rate per 1,000 people in nearly the same way in urban areas than they have in rural areas. In fact, it's a very, very mixed picture, and it's hard to detect any kind of trend whatsoever. So it suggests that while our kind of crime efforts might have been targeted in terms of our kind of big urban areas, our offence rates have not been nearly the same. So we need different explanations to understand what's been happening in terms of recorded offences compared with crimes. And again, particularly when you look at Strathclyde, Dumfries and Galloway, there's very little kind of there are some areas where there's a consistent trend, but actually many others where there's not, so it's much more variable. Actually, when you look at Northern, the picture in terms of rates per 1,000 people for offences is very similar to it is for crimes. So that would suggest that in the Northern Force, they didn't necessarily have a different approach to crimes and offences, but in the other areas they tended to. But again, if you look at that in terms of a map, we get a much more consistent kind of map in terms of centralised areas around Central and parts of Strathclyde that come out as the kind of worst areas, and then areas round about kind of Grampian, particularly Lothian and Borders, that come out best. Okay, so just a few concluding statements then. The first big thing to say is recorded crimes and offences show very, very different trends at the aggregate level compared to the local authority and the police force area, so it's important to break it down and understand what's happening across the whole of Scotland. We see a big fall in 30 local authorities in recorded crime, but only a fall in 9 local authorities in terms of recorded offences. The relative change in crime varies by local authority a bit, but more than 26 of the local authorities fell by more than 20%, so it's a much more consistent picture, whereas relative change in offences ranged from plus 117% to minus 55%. Absolute falls in crime clearly concentrated in urban areas, but much less so in terms of offences. And whereas we saw falls in all 8 legacy police force areas, we saw very different pictures in terms of the legacy police force areas when it came to changes in offences. Neighbouring local authorities within police force areas have highly consistent trends in crime, which suggests that crimes that policing at that level was consistent within police force areas more or less, but not in recorded offences. So there's very varying practice going on there, and that needs to be investigated. I mean, there may be very, very good reasons for that, but it needs to be investigated a bit more. Some local authorities buck the trend in recorded crimes. So in Fife and Dumfries and Galloway, we saw these kind of increases when other areas were declining. Some local authorities showed these big spikes in crime trends, but overall the recorded crime was fairly consistent over time, whereas there's much less consistency in terms of recorded offences. And the overall picture didn't change when population size within local authority was taken into account, but we do get a clearer picture of what's been happening, particularly within these big urban areas where crime was highest and it's fallen the most, so we need to understand what's happened there. Whereas in terms of looking at rates per 1,000 people in terms of offence trends, we see far less consistency. So what it suggests is that I think if we're looking at the kind of crime trends, we're seeing a kind of global picture across Scotland in terms of a fall, with 1 or 2 fluctuations along the way, which suggests that similar mechanisms might have explained that fall in crime. When we look at offences, we see a very mixed picture, and it's clear that actually policing practices and policies have had a much bigger impact on recorded offences than they have on recorded crimes. Okay.